HBO's The Gilded Age. Hey, I'm put you outside. A dinner invitation, once accepted, is a sacred obligation. If you die before the dinner takes place, your executor must attend. That is a quote from Ward McAllister, the subject of today's story, and that tells you almost everything that you need to know about him. But of course, I'm going to tell you a lot more. HBO's The Gilded Age is a television show that is brilliantly written by Gillian Fellows, the creator of Downton Abbey. It's returning for its second season on October 29th, and we're gearing up for its return here on this channel, Ty's Hot Mess History. I can't think of a better place. It's my favorite channel. Whether you watch the show or not, stay tuned for this episode. I'm covering some of the real-life people, places, and events that have been depicted on The Gilded Age, the TV show. But The Gilded Age was a real time in history. It lasted roughly from the 1870s until 1900, give or take a few years depending on which historian you ask. It was a period of massive economic change. Vast fortunes were made by a few. Sometimes those fortunes were lost. For the wealthy, it was all about a rival between old money families and new money families. For the working class, their thoughts were, to hell with all of them. Old or new, they've earned their wealth on our backs. The main characters on the show, The Gilded Age, come from fictional families that are like the old money and new money families that would have existed at that time, but they interact with some of the wealthiest and most noteworthy people who did live during the Gilded Age, like the Vanderbilts, J. Gould, J.P. Morgan, T. Thomas Fortune, and the topic of today's video, Ward McAllister. This is how he is described in part in the show's character guide. Quote, Ward McAllister is chiefly remembered now as the inventor of the phrase, the 400. This was the number of people who were worth bothering with in New York society. McAllister serves as Mrs. Astor's right-hand man, and his chief business and pleasure in life is to help her guard the gates to high society. End quote. It goes on to talk about his dealings with some of the other fictional characters in the show. But I'll leave that out because it's not important for this video. And I know that some of you who will watch this video do not watch the show, and I appreciate you for being here. But as I've said in previous videos, you don't have to follow that TV show to follow this video. We're talking about the real life of Ward McAllister, the high society snob who valued nothing more in life than wealthy people and a great party. And in the end, those rich people who he admired more than anything on earth turned on him. I don't know if the TV show, The Gilded Age, will last long enough to get to that part of his life, but we're going to cover it here today on this episode of Ty's Hot Mess History. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I put out content. And hit the like button to support this video. Thank you. Ward McAllister is the eccentric, highfalutin gatekeeper to New York City's high society on the Gilded Age. He is brilliantly played by Nathan Lane, who gives some good moments of comic relief on the show. From this point on in this episode, I think that I'll only mention the TV show one more time. If you watch the show, you know exactly who the character is. If you don't watch that show, I'm also glad that you're here today, and that's okay that you don't watch it, because we're going to get into his real life, which is better than fiction. At the height of his popularity in the late 1800s, Ward McAllister was the right-hand man to Caroline Astor, and he decided if multimillionaires got to be a part of the in crowd, his 400. The funny thing is that based on his own background, he likely never would have let himself become one of the 400. Ward was born on December 28, 1827 in Savannah, Georgia, to parents Judge Matthew Hall McAllister and Grace Charlotte. Now, this is the one last time that I want to mention the television show, The Gilded Age, in this video, because I have wondered since last season, does Nathan Lane play Ward McAllister with that comically thick Southern accent because Ward McAllister is from Georgia? Or did the research staff find something that led them to know or believe that that is the way that Ward McAllister would have talked? It's like a really thick Southern accent, and when he laughs, it's like, So I've always wondered, like, is that real, or are they just kind of, I guess, taking some creative license there? Anyway, Ward's father was a Princeton graduate who was prominent in Southern politics. He'd been elected as mayor of Savannah for multiple terms. He met Ward's mother, Grace, in 1820. They got married and had 5 sons and 1 daughter. The first was Ward's oldest brother. In 1895, the son reported that he had served in the Mexican War and was buried at West Point. But his name was never mentioned. I did a little digging and finally found his name, Julian McAllister. One of the things that stood out the most about him beyond his lifelong military career was that in 1862, his wife, Elizabeth, died of burns when a dress that she was wearing caught on fire. Can you imagine? Their second son was Hall McAllister, and he was one of the most successful lawyers on the West Coast. Then came Ward McAllister, the topic of today's video, who was born Samuel Ward McAllister. He grew up to be a very good real estate lawyer before he became a full-time socialite. But it seems like law and politics just ran in his family's blood. And 2 years after Ward was born, his younger brother, Francis, was born. He studied theology and became a minister. He was the only sibling at Ward McAllister's side when he died, but we'll get there later. In 1832, his last brother, Benjamin Cutler, was born, and surprise, surprise, he went on to practice law as well. An interesting thing that I learned about him during my research was that there were 2 totally different sets of obituaries printed for him when he died in 1879. One set, mainly the ones printed in and around San Francisco, where he had made a living and established his family, said that he died from pneumonia. Almost everywhere else in the country printed that he died from an accidental gunshot wound. The story there was that he had gone to visit friends and family for the holidays in Florida, and a friend accidentally shot him. I guess Florida man stories have always been with us. If you know, you know. But the thought back then was that maybe the San Francisco area papers printed his cause of death as pneumonia because they didn't want to shock his family because his family was there. And in 1883, his parents had their last child, a girl named Harriet Hannah. I didn't find anything about her except that she died the same year as Benjamin. Before Ward and his brothers and his father, Ward's paternal grandfather had been a judge too, Judge Matthew McAllister. He was appointed by George Washington as the first United States District Attorney for the state of Georgia. In 1830, when Ward was in his early 20s, he left Georgia and moved in with a relative. Her name was Mary Telfair, and he lived in New York City with her. While he stayed with her, he studied law, then went west to live and practice law in California. A few years later, he went back to the East Coast and got married. His wife was Sarah Gibbons of New Jersey. She came from a wealthy Southern family, so he married into some money. Even though his family seemed like an important one, they were basically only big fish in a small pond when compared to the likes of the multimillionaires who Ward would encounter later in Manhattan's very competitive social scene. And when considering that by those people's standards, the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, and the likes. He was poor. It kind of makes you wonder what it was about him that allowed him to judge anyone else's worthiness. He must have had charm and social grace for days. And I say this because he had to have something that captivated people. And the way that he was written about in multiple sources was not flattering, to say the least. His family wasn't that important, and the money that they had didn't compensate for their lack of social standing. He wasn't extremely good-looking or wildly ambitious. He was actually the opposite of the men who he was judging to see if they were good enough to become a part of high society. This is how he was described in one of the many articles about him after his death. Quote, "In appearance, Mr. McAllister was of medium size, thick-set, weighing about 175 pounds, of a ruddy complexion. He wore mustaches and an imperial, which in his latter years were gray. He walked with a peculiar swinging gait. Though not a wealthy man, he enjoyed a comfortable income of $20,000 a year." End quote. Now, that $20,000 per year in the late 1800s would have made him very comfortable. For perspective, adjusting for inflation, that $20,000 per year is like having roughly $600,000 per year in 2020-30. But when you stack his $20,000 against men who are making literal millions in that same time period, a lot of those men who were being judged by Ward McAllister would have been billionaires by today's standards. So what made it happen for him? How did he climb his way to the top of the social ladder? Well, when he was still relatively young, he came into some money after one of his relatives died. $1,000. Now, even back in the 1850s, $1,000 wasn't exactly life-changing money. Getting that would have been like getting about $40,000 today. But it was enough money to give yourself a boost to create the kind of life that you ultimately wanted to live. So naturally, Ward's friends thought that he would take that $1,000 and start a business or make some smart investments. And I guess that in a very loose way, you could say that he made an investment. He bought a fancy suit. Yes, he spent the entire $1,000 on a suit. And while it's easy to dismiss this purchase as just something that a fool would do with his money, and I don't disagree with that, it also gives us a look into his thought process and just how important looking important was to him. How important wanting to be seen in the finest of clothing with the finest of people was to him. How much that mattered to him. To make matters worse, I guess you could say, this suit wasn't designed for going to important business meetings to impress future business partners or clients. This suit was made for a society ball, so that he could impress the wealthy partygoers. It was literally just an extravagant costume that he would wear for only one night. Can you imagine getting a $40,000 inheritance and spending it all on one outfit to wear one time? I know that I can't. But let me know what you would do if you were to get an unexpected $40,000 right now. How would you spend it? I don't know what I'd do with it, but I know that I would not buy an outfit to wear for one night. So here was the situation. There was a socially prominent woman named Mrs. John C. Stevens. She was holding a fancy dress ball, and she gave Ward McAllister an invitation to it. Apparently, this ball had been the talk of the town in the weeks leading up to it. All of the socialites were spending a lot of money for wild costumes to wear to this dance. Ward was thrilled just to get the invitation, and he was not going to pass up on an opportunity to go. but he knew that the costume that he could afford would be no match for what the other attendees would be wearing. But luckily for him, a relative who left him $1,000 died just in time for Ward to be able to get that money and to spend it on a suit. A suit that would help him to not only blend in with the wealthy crowd that he admired so much, but even to stand out among them. Here's how his actions were described in a newspaper from that time. Quote, "No sooner had he pocketed his $1,000 than Ward McAllister hurried off to the most fashionable costumer of that day. He spent the entire amount on his costume, which was the richest and handsomest at the ball, and made Ward McAllister an outstanding figure for a few short hours." End quote. A few short hours. You can tell where his priorities were. After the ball, Ward left to go spend some time in Europe. He liked spending time there because he could live comfortably for less money than he could in New York City. Now, just keep in mind, he had no money, at least not in a significant sense. No high birth, no credentials. So it was nothing more than charm and an expensive suit that opened every door for Ward McAllister. Take note, fellas. But when he returned to NYC, he met the Commodore Vanderbilt, who had by this time become a multi-million-dollar railroad magnate. For some reason, Vanderbilt just liked Ward McAllister. He liked him so much that he wanted to help him out financially. He could see that where finances were concerned, Ward was way out of his league in keeping up with the affluent crowd that he wanted to be around. So Vanderbilt would give McAllister stock market tips, likely some insider trading info, and those tips would allow McAllister to earn some pretty big profits. But what did he do? He spent the money almost as quickly as he earned it, and he didn't use that money to expand his investment portfolio. No, that would have been silly. Ward spent that money on more parties, more expensive dinners, more entertainment that kept his face in the faces of those moneyed people of Manhattan. Commodore Vanderbilt hated seeing Ward be so foolish with his money. He wanted Ward to have a future that would last him a lifetime, so on several occasions he offered to set up businesses for him. McAllister always refused it, telling Vanderbilt, "Society is my business, and I'll make a success of it." And as we know, he did make a success of it. Unfortunately for him, his successful society business didn't come with any long-term money, at least not the way that Ward ran his business operations. It seems like his company manual could be summed up in one sentence: spend everything you earn on expensive parties. Sounds like a lot of fun, but not sustainable. If it sounds odd to you that a man like Commodore Vanderbilt, who was so focused, so driven, so business-minded, would have kept wasting his time trying to help a foolish man like Ward McAllister become a successful, money-making businessman, here's an anecdote from an 1895 edition of The Sun that might give you some insight. Quote, "Commodore Vanderbilt frequently told the story of how McAllister had admitted to him that he had watched a great dinner given by Queen Victoria, after having been smuggled through the servants' entrance to Buckingham Palace by an English friend. And to canny Commodore Vanderbilt, that represented an ambition to go places and do things." End quote. I mean, I don't know if a person ever existed who lived more for a gala than Ward McAllister. But back to his society business, he really was a success until he wasn't. But he had a long run, almost 20 years. And it all started and ended with Mrs. Astor, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the Mrs. Astor, the matriarch of the male line of American Astors. One of her sons was John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man who died on the Titanic. Not long after he hit the social scene in that knockout ball costume, he got to meet Mrs. Astor in 1872. It was reported that that was the supreme moment in his life, and he made the most of it. She liked him too, but she could see that he was in awe of her. She was the top hostess in New York, and it was clear that he knew everything about taking entertaining to new heights. So, to be frank, Mrs. Astor saw in Ward McAllister someone who she could use. And he was so starstruck by her that he was willing to let her do it. With Ward McAllister at her side, all of her society friends who had always accepted her party invitations because she was Caroline Astor were now eager to accept her party invitations because Ward knew how to party. So the replies to her invitations weren't yes, but heck yes. And it was through his connection with Mrs. Astor that the phrase McAllister's 400 was born. When he was helping to stage the production that was the Astor's annual ball, a news reporter went to the location to get some info for the New York World. Mrs. Astor was too busy to talk to the reporter, so she simply put Ward McAllister on the job. And of course, he was all too excited to speak to the press, and especially on behalf of Mrs. Astor. When asked how many people would attend, he told the reporter, quote, "Only 400. Mrs. Astor never has more than 400 guests because that is the capacity of her ballroom." And from there, the 400, or McAllister's 400, was coined and is still associated with his name until this day. And for years, Ward McAllister put on balls, dances, and parties for the well-off set in New York in conjunction with Mrs. Astor. The whole time, he was judging who got to come to his parties and who did not, who got to be a part of society and who could not. Millionaires and their families sought his approval. They needed his nod to know that they were in. And the whole time that this was going on, McAllister was living a very modest life in a small, plain house and barely had any money. But he knew how to put on airs. Some would say, fake it till you make it. Well, Ward knew how to fake it, but he never made it. Yet still, he rose up in the ranks of society as long as he was Mrs. Astor's pet. But you know what they say? What goes up must come down. And after decades of being Mrs. Astor's party man, he went broke. I wonder how all of those millionaires who were not allowed access to high society because Ward McAllister didn't want them there, I wonder how they felt knowing that a poor man who was an imposter was the one who was telling them that they were not good enough. McAllister transitioned from the climactic point to the downhill slope in his society career in 1890. That was when his book, Society as I Have Found It, was published. To be precise, it was called Society as I Have Found It, The Cuisine, Culture, and Fashions of Europe and North America in the 19th Century by a Man Who Toured the Era's Finds. You know, a quick short title. And the book made him seem as pompous and arrogant as that title sounds. It was meant to be a tell-all about his society parties that detailed some of the most embarrassing and salacious moments of the city's elite. This memoir was supposed to make him a lot of money because he knew that the outsiders wanted to know what was going on behind the doors of those ballrooms. But in the book, he didn't disclose names. It was written in a manner that if you didn't know those situations personally, you would have had a hard time figuring out who he was writing about. He didn't have a kind word to say about anyone in the book, and the critics didn't have a kind word to say about him or his stupid book. As a matter of fact, it made him a subject of ridicule, with a reviewer for The Autocrat writing, quote, "To assume to describe a society destitute of humor, of wit, of position or distinction, of kindly deeds and generous, unostentatious hospitality is but to make the author and the subject alike ridiculous." End quote. This is how he was talking about his friends, the society that he created. And this reviewer is saying if those people are that way, lacking wit, humor, position, etc., you're the one who picked them, so you must be the same way too, Ward. His book didn't end up being the slam that he thought it would be against the people he wrote about. It made everyone look at him like he was stupid. Another critic joked that he would need to write a second book called Society as I Have Lost It. Good joke, and I see what you did there. But that certainly was the case. And was it even worth it for Ward? I wonder. He only made $2,000 from book sales in the end. So it didn't accomplish his goal of making him a rich man. But it did accomplish one thing that he did not expect. His writing that book caused him to fall out of grace with the society that he loved so much and helped to create. But the most crushing part for him was that it made an enemy out of Mrs. Astor, his queen of 20 years. And it is without question that he died a bitter man. The high society that he helped to build turned its back on him when he grew old and out of fashion. He felt as though he had been used and cast aside by a society that had kept him poor instead of making him rich. He really should have listened to Vanderbilt, who had on more than one occasion given him tips on how to get rich. Literally, how to get rich. This was probably the only time in the history of man that some get-rich-quick advice actually would have worked. But that's neither here nor there. On the last week of January in 1895, Ward McAllister got sick with the grip. Today we call that influenza or the flu. After being down for a few days, it looked like he would recover. Then he became more ill than the days before. On January 31st, 1895, Ward McAllister died at home, while there was a charity ball going on at Carnegie Hall, an event for which in his better days, he certainly would have been at the top of the guest list. Law really was in this family's DNA. Ward's eldest son and namesake, Ward McAllister Jr., who was not among the family members surrounding him when he died, was also an attorney in California, and that's where he was when his father died. But Ward did have some family at his bedside. His wife was there, his other son, Hayward McAllister, and his daughter, Louise, were all there. And his brother, Reverend Dr. Francis Marion McAllister, was there as well. I told you that I'd get back to him. And this brother also died the same year as Ward. And after all of those years of service devoted to his queen, Mrs. Astor, she did not even attend his funeral. She, instead, held a dinner party that night. Ward McAllister's life is an example of when butt-kissing goes tragically wrong. But till this day, he remains the inspiration for the term the 400 or McAllister's 400. You can search his name on Google and the 400 will likely appear. And by the way that he lived a majority of his adult life for the frivolity and pomp and circumstance of high society, he might be honored to know that he is still widely remembered for curating his list of 400 members who are worthy enough for society, in his eyes. If you want to see a story about a lady who had plenty of money but was too scandalous for high society, check out my video on Arabella Huntington, the real-life inspiration for Mrs. Chamberlain on the Gilded Age. She was a woman who lived during the Gilded Age, whose marriage brought her a lot of money and the scandal that kept her out of society. And if you want to move a little bit past the Gilded Age, you can check out my video about Mrs. Astor's son, John Jacob Astor IV, and his disastrous Titanic experience that led to his death. I'll leave links to both videos in the description box. My sources for this story are The Sun Archives, 1895, World's Fair Chicago, 1893, City Beautiful blog, and Pittsburgh Sun-Telegraph Archives, 1941. Thank you so much for supporting this content. HBO's The Gilded Age. Hey, I'm gonna put you outside. It was written in a manner that they... Charlie. Stop. You're supposed to be asleep. That was probably the only time in the history of man that some... Hey. Charlie. Leave her alone. Law really was in this family's DNA. Ward's eldest son and namesake, Ward McAllister Jr., who was not among the family members surrounding him when he died, was also an attorney in California, and that's where he was when his father died. Hey! I'm trying to do some work so you can eat. Y'all can play after I finish recording. Charlie, leave it alone. Let me finish. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the hot mess history. The link is in the description box.